Welcome, everyone, to the Attuned Therapist podcast. My name is Rebecca Tatum, and I am your host. And I am excited to introduce my guest today, Alena Garcia-Inzauro. Alena, welcome.
Good morning, and hope everybody's well.
Mm-hmm. So, for the sake of giving everyone a sense of who you are, because I know you, would you share a bit about who you are and what you do?
Certainly. Well, I am a therapist. I currently work with a group practice. I have been in private practice for, probably 2 years now. I specialize in working with the LGBT population. I work with adolescents, young adults, as well as adults. I do a lot of work with the trans population. It's something that I was excited about working with this particular population type when I transitioned into private practice. Prior to private practice, I worked in community mental health. I worked in community mental health for approximately about 5 years. I worked with two different agencies, and one of the agencies is where I got the opportunity to work alongside you, which was a learning experience in many, many ways. It really kind of helped me understand what it is that I was wanting for myself, as well as challenging myself, because coming into this field, I had a general idea of what I wanted to do, but I didn't know the details or the opportunities that were available to me, because I felt like I was being led and not really decisive in my own autonomy. So it was just kind of great to have that window open and kind of see a little things from a different perspective. So that's kind of a little bit of what got me here, was just a little bit of curiosity, a lot of curiosity.
Yeah. Yeah, so you and I know each other from community mental health, right? So we go way
Mm-hmm.
back in that sense. Um, in many ways, I feel like you know a different version of me from then compared to now. And you might
Mm-hmm.
even feel the same of just what I was signing up for myself and for those around me compared to what I would never sign up for now. But when you were speaking to that sense of being led, were you speaking to like transitioning out of the educational tract into the work setting and feeling led into agency work?
Right. Well, not necessarily agency work, just more so like I felt coming into the therapist role, fresh out of college, I felt like there wasn't a lot of ability to kind of make my own decisions in some regard, especially going into community mental health. It was more like this is what the requirement is. Like you don't really have a decision in terms of what it looks like. And I was kind of learning my grounding and kind of feeling through things that were I I can say now were beyond my scope of practice, because I didn't know exactly what I was dealing with. Albeit, yes, I understand that you have to expose yourself to some of it to learn some of those skills. But like the first couple of years, I truly felt like I was over my head, and it kind of created a huge sense of self doubt in my ability to actually work in this field, because unfortunately there wasn't good guidance. I've always said, even in my internship, while I was going to school, I had a poor supervisor. In the first couple of years working in community mental health, I continued with the poor supervision. It wasn't until I was fortunate to work along with you, where you were my supervisor, where I felt like I was able to be heard and seen, like where I was able to say, like, hey, here are my deficits. Like, how can we make these deficits into something that was more strength? And that's when I felt a little bit more at ease. I'm like, okay, I'm feeling a sense of confidence that I am where I need to be.
It's very sweet of you to say. Genuinely, it is. And it's relatable. I think a lot of us relate to that experience of being in whatever our educational tract is and internships and practicums. And typically, at least in our state, the internships and practicum settings are agency or community mental health. I don't recall within my bachelor's or graduate level program the internship options. I don't recall there being like private practice setting options,
Mm-hmm.
or at least they weren't well known. And it wasn't until I started to exit community mental health that I started to realize how much opportunity there is in the private practice sector, that there are group practices that you can have interns at, and associate level license providers. I just wasn't aware of that option, even
Yeah.
years post graduation, but especially when in a position to be deciding where am I going to complete my internship, or where is my place of employment going to be as I exit my learning experience. It felt very kind of what you said. This is just what you do, right? This is the next step. You go
Hmm.
into this setting.
Yeah.
And, to speak to what you were describing earlier around like scope of practice, or, just being in a position to feel like you're in over your head. I can relate to that as the provider, but even from like a supervising position, right? Like when I reflect on being your supervisor in that setting, I was constantly faced with this decision making of someone has left, a provider has left, and there's an
Hmm.
entire load that has to go somewhere. Uh, has to, right? There's some legality and ethical considerations around just having an entire caseload go unassigned. And to give everyone a frame of reference, we're talking about a caseload of like 80 to 100, because the agency that we worked at, if you were a therapist, you would have clients that you're providing therapy to, but also you would have clients that you were the case manager for, even if you weren't providing therapy. So within this agency, if clients had medication services and that was the only service they were receiving, but they were a certain like risk level, essentially, they couldn't be what was
Hmm.
called meds only. They had to be assigned to a therapist for monthly check ins. And there's some ethical considerations for that in and of itself that I now realize. But at that time, it felt normal. It felt appropriate because the entire structure of this agency said that it was. And I was kind of like raised up in this setting and early on in my career. And so, as a supervisor, when a therapist would leave and I'm presented with this situation of there are 80 to 100 clients to assign and disperse, um, one, I didn't have time to go in and look at every chart and see what is their diagnosis, what is their treatment plan, what's their history, what's their needs, and then assign based off that. I quite literally could have not handled that within my own structure and like work schedule. And so what it created was this scenario of reassigning purely based off numbers. And I
Yeah.
like have a feeling coming up in my stomach admitting this out loud, right? Now looking back, that I was assigning clients to other professionals based off caseload sizes. And if
Hmm.
there were certain clients that I was familiar with or certain situations that I already knew, then I absolutely was assigning based off that information that I had available to me. But like I said, I didn't have it within me to go in and figure that out for 80 to 100 clients. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I had a firsthand part in contributing to other therapists practicing outside of their scope, right? And at the time, I didn't see it that way.
Hmm.
But in looking back, I'm like, oh my God, I don't know how that structure within that agency didn't create more complaints. And there were plenty of complaints coming in, don't get me wrong, from the clients, but more complaints with like insurance carriers and boards.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you so much because I think you and I took very similar, in some regards, stepping stones, right? Because we both kind of started, or you started a little bit more earlier on in the case management roles in some aspect, but I came in as a therapist, and after you left, I stepped in to your position. So I know what that looks like. I got on both sides of that. I got it where the caseloads were given to me as a clinician, and then later on where I had to kind of determine, okay, how do I ethically like assign these cases? Because it was at this time where there was such high turnover. I don't know necessarily if there's a time when there was not in community mental health, but it just seemed like it was just so much. It was during the period where the board had changed it, where a lot of associated counselors can be going to private practice. So we were losing a lot of clinicians at that time. And it was very challenging to fill the roles, the seats that we had available for openings for clinicians. So that was like, so there was just so many challenges, and it became to this point where like I was just becoming just very physically reactive in a very negative way whenever a notification of termination of employment was coming through. I'm like, great, like everybody's already at capacity, like how do I make this determination? And it's just that much more challenging when you don't get the needed support from not only the staff but also management. And you kind of just have to make that determination what's in the best interest of everybody involved, not only my clinicians but also the clients. And that's just that kind of struggle that I dealt with. And I think that's probably a large part of that tipping point where I'm like, I had went into this position with this idea that I was going to stay. You know, I had an idea, okay, I'm going to commit myself for X number of years because I wanted that experience. I wanted that challenge, but it just got to that point where I felt like it was just too much. It was just too heavy for me. I'm like, there has to be something else. And that's kind of what that curious thinking led me to, like, well, I wonder what private practice would look like. And I didn't dive head in. I did it part time for a while. I think it was about 2 days a week or 2 evenings a week where I worked in private practice. And I think it was like maybe my second or third week. I'm like, holy cow, I need to figure out how to do this full time. I need to transition to this full time because the autonomy is just so different. Like the red tape you don't have to worry about, and the ability to kind of create whatever your case look like, or what any of that will look like. That's something I had not ever experienced, and it was just such a freeing feeling that I just could not walk away from it.
It's like you got a taste of something that you just had to have more of. Yeah, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. Well, and I think, when I reflect back on, the specific setting that you and I know, right? Which is a very specific agency, right? We worked at one place together. But I do believe in my heart that the concerns that you and I can identify within that setting are applicable to many other settings. It
Oh,
does feel like a
mm-hmm.
systematic concern. It's not reflective of like one particular situation or
Yep.
perhaps relationship, but I can break it down to, even within the setting we were at, there were certain relational issues going on as well, and so there's layers to it, right? But
Mm-hmm.
from the systematic perspective, it does feel like, to kind of generalize it, I don't know if it's fair to, but for the sake of dialogue, it does feel like that setting and that system as a whole invites us as the provider, as the therapist, to care more about the other than ourselves, to put the other
Mm-hmm.
first. And I do believe that's reflective even in the experiences you and I can relate to as supervisors in that setting of, these clients have to get reassigned regardless of where that provider is already at, what the provider needs, but also regardless of what these clients also even need, right? There's this sense of
Mm-hmm.
like there's another person or entity that their needs are more important than our own, right? So within Arizona, our Medicaid programming is called Access, and within that setting, there is this high emphasis that to keep our contracts and everything going with Access, we couldn't deny intakes, we couldn't deny new clients. So our doors are just open, regardless of
Mm-hmm.
staffing issues. The doors are open, and that is also reflective, right, of like this other entity's needs are more important than our own. And there's a
Yes.
helplessness to that, right? Like a logical solution is to just not take new clients for a little bit. Like, let us breathe. We're drowning. Let us get on like
Yes.
snorkel gear or something to keep going, right? And that just was never an option on the table, ever. For eight
Oh.
years I was there, it was never something we did. We always were taking new clients. And so, and again, I don't think it's unique just to that agency, but this just generalized stance of the therapist is less important.
Mm-hmm.
Your needs are less important. Your needs for regulation, your needs for your bodily function, your needs of just fill in the blank are
Yeah.
not as important, or they're important, they just have to come secondary, right?
Mm-hmm.
All this dialogue around self-care, but yet your caseload is like 130, 140 clients that you need to contact at least monthly, right? And also give therapy too. Um, and then I think you and I can relate to what was so attractive about private practice is that scenario is just flipped on its head.
Yeah.
Where, yeah. And it's almost like, agency work, community mental health, we were surviving. And to be very cliche, now we get to thrive, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's reflective of like our needs get to be met and honored first and foremost. And that it's
Mm-hmm.
not just allowed, but almost like a requirement. Like I'm sure your group practice with you having others around you would call you out if you weren't
Yes.
engaging in some way that was honoring of your needs.
Yeah, it's like it. I know when I went on like one of my first week vacations, right? Like in the past, like when I worked in community mental health, I was still checking in emails, respond to emails, do those no things, right? And then when I tried to do that in my private practice, the owner is like, "What are you doing? No." Like, I do not want to hear any, I don't want to see any email responses until you're set to return back. What are you doing to yourself? And like just that constant reinforcement, like time off is time off, and that constant checking in, like, hey, how are you, like, how are you with your caseload, like, can I send you some referrals, like just that autonomy. Again, I cannot get past that word of autonomy, like just that ability to be like, hey, are you able to, like, do you want to, and not so much, oh, I'm sorry, but I'm going to give you this. I've not had that experience, and it's, again, it's just something that I never thought was accessible in this field, and to experience it is almost like you don't want to let it go.
Nor should we, yeah. I think this is a new baseline, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now we
Yes.
know what it is we are willing and not willing to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it's just a very interesting experience, because like I can see that sense, even how it changes me as a clinician, because it allows me to show up in my sessions where I'm more attuned with my clients. I'm able to kind of see where they're coming from and where they want to go. Because when you have like nearly 100 clients on your caseload, albeit not all of them are therapeutic, but there's still a large number of them. Sometimes it's just very hard to personalize some of that experience. You want to be there with your client, you want to kind of fill those moments with them and celebrate their progress, but sometimes, like, when it just gets to that point of burnout, it just like becomes so enmeshed, like it just becomes all one, and I just didn't want to have that experience again.
And what I also found challenging too back then, well, actually, two thoughts came in. One, when we were asked to wear that case manager hat alongside being a therapist, I look back on that now from this stance. It wasn't clear to me then, but there are some like significant ethical issues of dual relationship, right? So being the facilitator for these child, family, and team meetings,
Mm-hmm.
right, case manager, but then also I'm this therapist for this family and or client. And I can recall plenty of experiences where it was scheduled as a counseling session, but because I wear this like secondary hat of case manager, there's many situations where the families are seeking something from me as a case manager. And so
Mm-hmm.
that line was just, it didn't even really exist, right? There was no line because I'm one human. Um,
Right.
so there's that, but then I also think um, no one can be effective truly with doing in-home services on a regular basis
Mm-hmm.
with that high of caseload.
Yeah. Most definitely, because there there's a reason why they're electing to get in-home services, right? Their needs look different. And
Hmm.
generally their needs is because they're at a higher, let's say, risk, whatever that might look like. But if you have so many of those types of clients on your caseload, how are you supposed to provide the needed service? Because the goal is to help reduce their dependence on additional services, because generally people who had in-home services, they just didn't have therapy. Oftentimes they had case managers or they had DCS involvement. There's just so many entities that were also involved in the child's case. So the goal again was to kind of reduce those needs of the step down services, but we couldn't always do that. My clinicians couldn't even always do that because there was just so many clients that needed to be seen. So towards the end, we unfortunately transitioned more out of the in-home where we just did in-office because there wasn't enough staff to provide that needed service. And which I thought was very unique for the agency that we worked for, because there wasn't a lot of staff that was dedicated to that approach. But it was really unfortunate when we had to move away from that because I felt like it was effective when it was utilized appropriately.
Mhm. Yeah, and yeah, I can agree with you that with the right structure, in-home therapy can absolutely be effective. And I think that, and speaking to like that caseload size and what you were saying earlier of like you can't really show up for your clients in the way that you genuinely want to when there's such a high level of stress and expectation kind of sitting on your shoulders, right? And um, just the driving component too from home to home is an added stress, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, is it really hot out, right? We live in Phoenix, Arizona. Is it summertime? That's miserable. And then you got to find the right gas station for a restroom. There's just this added like weight to it that is different from office work, very much so. And so I'm curious, you had made a comment earlier of towards your tail end of being in community mental health, feeling that reactivity in you, right? And noticing that and realizing like this isn't sustainable for me. I'm curious to hear kind of your transition out of community mental health and into group practice and how that felt and what you were
Well,
noticing in that change.
well, I think a lot of it was again being more aware of what I needed. You spoke on it earlier about how we tend to prioritize ourselves lower at the end, right? Where or we prioritize everybody else or everything else before ourselves. And it became to that moment where I was like, where am I? Like, where am I literally in this lineup of people and things in front of me? And recognizing, okay, like putting a little light into my own self and my own needs. I was like, whoa, I'm like really kind of burning both ends at this. Like, this isn't really what I had hoped for. And, being human, I felt like I wasn't being recognized for the efforts that I was making in my workplace. I felt like I was being kind of utilized in a very unhealthy way. Like, I felt like I was constantly the bearer of bad news. Again, this was during the pandemic where there were so many different shifts and shakeups and, introducing telehealth. Like, there was just so many changes, and I felt like oftentimes I was the one kind of holding the bag in some aspect, and it just added to so many other components of what was going on. And I think that's when I started seeing a lot of people also growing professionally. And these are people who I kind of grew up with in the field, where I kind of saw them stepping away from community mental health, doing their own things in different ways. So I think that's what led a lot of to my curiosity of like, well, if they can do it, surely I can as well. And I think it was that lack of confidence, like, because private practice, like the idea of it just sounds so intimidating because it's all on you. Like, you don't have that safety, you don't have that security. But knowing the payoff of it, I think it was what was my driving force. Yeah, some of it was financial. I won't lie about that. But I think it was just more so like being able to be more selective, being able to say no. Like, no, I'm at capacity, or I'm not a good fit for you. Like, those are things you would never be able to say in CMH, in community mental health. So that was one of those big things, and that's what kind of really grabbed me into it. That, and I won't lie, some of that like non-access related paperwork that I don't have to worry about filling out or keeping on top of, because administrative work can be very overwhelming when you're in community mental health.
Yeah, no, say it with your chest. I don't want to do that much paperwork and I want to get paid more.
Yeah,
Yeah, there's no shame
yeah,
in that. Yeah, absolutely. We weren't paid enough. you and I,
Mm-hmm.
undoubtedly. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, to be as transparent as possible, I left the agency we were at because I didn't feel like I was being paid enough. I wasn't being compensated or recognized, kind of what you were saying, for how much I was left holding the bag and how many pieces I was picking up on a daily basis for other people. Like, I'll just say it, and it is what it is. I put myself in that position. I signed up for it. No
Mm-hmm.
one was taking advantage of me in the sense that, like, I let them. I was like,
Mm-hmm.
please do it. That's how it was. Like,
Right.
that, right? It was meeting my own, like, trauma needs, right? Like, my
Yes.
own unresolved stuff had some
Mm-hmm.
needs associated with it, and part of it was to be the perfect one and the shiny one, and yeah, I got to be that, but it came with the one being stuck holding the bag, like you said, right? And so
Yeah.
coming into private practice and just having the opportunity for financial security. Like, to be clear, you and I aren't talking about having yachts and going to Europe every other month. Like, I'm just talking about, like, I can finally start paying off some debt while also, like, managing my monthly bills. Like, I just have security. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
wealthy, right? I may someday be able to identify that way because I've worked my ass off, but right now it's just that I get to have financial security. And I did not have that
Right.
before. And yeah, less paperwork.
Mm-hmm.
Who likes paperwork? No, there's not a single therapist that's like, that is my favorite part of the job.
Right.
It was too
It's like
much.
that's my jam. Like
Yeah. So what else? What have you noticed, like, with your body or like with your personal life, whatever you're comfortable sharing, even if it's just like generally? Because I've noticed a lot of shifts for myself being in a different setting, right? And so I'm curious to know what you've noticed for yourself.
well, I mean, what I've noticed is like again, I'm just able to kind of show up in other parts of my life. Where albeit like yes, I had friendships, I had those types of relationships, but it was always the same conversation because most of my friends, because I moved out here to Arizona knowing nobody. Most of my connections have been with therapists that I've worked with, and that's what most of my friend circle still looks like. Which there's nothing wrong with that, but for a period, it was just this continued conversation of how miserable we were working in community mental health collectively. And it got to that point where it's like, can we stop having these conversations? Like, there has to be something more of value about us than just that. So once we all kind of grew up in our own way and we kind of stepped further away from community mental health. And sure enough, the dialogue that we engaged in was different. When we went out to dinners, we were able to check in about our own personal lives. With it be family, our romantic, our travel, whatever that looked like, it wasn't so much focused on, oh my God, can you imagine I got like 20 more clients, or, I worked 50 hours this week. Like just those things that was just becoming even heavier outside of the office. And working in private practice, I've also been able to explore different parts of my life. As you know, recently I got into riding motorcycles. That's probably something I would not have ever done working in community mental health, because I was just so focused on just kind of surviving. I was in that survival mentality, and being able to kind of step away from that and explore, like, whoa, I wonder what this door looks like, and kind of walking through that with confidence, like, okay, let's see what it brings out. So that's kind of that. And also, I've been able to travel. I able to connect with a partner who kind of helps me with some of this. And I don't even know what kind of partner I would be for him if I was still there. Because I know that when I would get home from work, like I would just fall into the couch and just kind of just like that was the extent of it. Like have dinner, crawl into bed, and rinse and repeat. And on the weekends, it was like, okay, let's just try to figure out how much energy we have and what we can do. And now, like, I work half the amount of hours, and I'm able to commit to things outside of my work identity, but still being able to sustain an amazing relationship with the people I work with. So it's not like I'm losing, it's just so much more that I'm gaining.
With a newness, right? Like, there's a new interest and hobby that you've developed that's like not casual. It's like you ride motorcycles now. Like
Mhm.
there's a whole other like, oh, there's a word that's escaping me, but essentially like branch of you. That's not the right word,
Mhm.
right? A motorcycle branch. You have that now, but like so much there, right? Like you're traveling places, you're riding places, you're going places that you've probably never been before. And so there's
Mhm.
this whole new avenue of you that I think it's super fair for you to identify probably would not have taken place. Um,
Yeah.
you remained in that prior setting.
Yeah. I mean, albeit again, like it wasn't all bad, right? Because I feel like I needed that experience in some capacity. Maybe not as long as I was there, but I
Mm.
needed that experience because it helped create a lot of those fundamentals, that foundation for me. And as well, I still have long term friendships, including yourself, with people that I've met and worked with from there. And I wouldn't take that away. It's just the depth of how much it requires of you is the part where I still can be very resentful about. The extreme version of it, I remember when I left, I told one of my friends, I'm like, not to minimize people's experience, but it's just like, I felt like I left an abusive relationship. Like, you don't know the extent of how bad it is until you leave, where like, oh my god, like I accepted that as a norm. Like I allowed myself to kind of go through that or be willing to do that, like all of that, like it brought a lot of negative emotion from that. And I think a lot of it has to do with my own history of being in unhealthy relationships in the past. Like there was just so much familiarity and similarity to that. It was very hard for me not to see it that way. And like I was kind of a little, I guess I could say now, a little shameful because I allowed it to happen again. Like I didn't see it, like where I'm like, wow, like there were signs in it, just like, in my toxic relationships in the past, where I just kind of put those red flags aside because I had to show up. And like, it took a while for me to just allow it to be an experience, albeit, yeah, I could have made changes or, I could have spoke up. I could have done, right? I should have, could have. I can go that to death. But the fact of the matter is, it's an experience and it's one I'm choosing not to explore again.
Yeah. Well, I think in many ways, you and I both were doing the best we could, just with where,
Mm-hmm.
with what we knew, with what we didn't know about ourselves, about the world, right? About what was available to us, what wasn't. Like, we both started our careers in that setting. So to give some grace, like we didn't know what we didn't know. And I would agree with you, like we needed something from that experience to lead us to where we are today, right? Like that, there's a connection there. And I appreciate you recognizing kind of that balance of like, as we connect with that saltiness and that resentment that we can both tap into, also recognizing that we have a foundation of experience that is like unmatched, that I know how to do
Mm-hmm.
an intake of any type
Yes.
of presentation. Like, throw it at me. Throw it at me. I know what to do with it. Right. And especially in this setting, I have, like you said earlier, so much autonomy about what I do with that. Right. It's not a matter of this is a presentation I've never seen before and now I have to work with them. Rather, it's, oh, wow, I am not your person. I do not have the training that you deserve to have. Here are the referrals for the people who are your people. Best of luck.
Mm-hmm.
Right. We get to do that now. And so there is a level of confidence and assurity that I think you and I both carry that comes from, exposure therapy from years of just being like thrown in it. But, as a result, that's like you and I can move on our feet, right? I'm sure
Mm-hmm.
you can
Very
relate
much.
to that. Like, yeah, we can think quick and do it from a stance that as I've grown in my practice here as a solo practitioner, um, being very clear with myself around what are my ethics compared to what
Mm-hmm.
I learned before, and trusting my sense of like intuition or my gut that unfortunately in community mental health, there was many times I was taught not to listen to that, or I
Yeah.
wasn't allowed to, in the sense, like I didn't have that permission to. And fast forward presently, that has been something I've grown to really appreciate, that when I do those consultation calls, if it just doesn't feel right, I don't have to schedule them.
Hmm.
Right? Just say, not within my scope, here are referrals for you, you know?
Yeah.
And that's enough. And that's allowed.
Yeah, I agree because you bring up a really good point in terms of ethics. Like I remember those moments where you had that not very good feeling. And sometimes you couldn't even put a pin in it. You couldn't even pull something even from the board, like anything like that. You just didn't feel good, right?
Yep.
And you trying to kind of bring that to leadership, like, hey, this doesn't feel so right. Like this, there's something a little if about this. And I mean, oftentimes it was met with, well, I'm sorry, we're just gonna have to continue with it. And like being able to be in private practice, and when you have those moments of like this is very ethical, I'm not sure of the ethics on this, like you have that ability to be like, no, this isn't for me. Or I have to make sure I do my own due diligence and not rely on like corporate agency. You know what I mean? What is their due diligence? Because oftentimes they didn't match with ours because they didn't understand our circumstances. So it's just very nice just to be able to kind of make that decision on your own and not wait for them to check in with whoever and so on and so on. It's just, I don't know, it's just a different game, one that I greatly appreciate.
Yeah. Yeah. And I can hear, as you were describing that, the limitations when you have a setting that's large, right? Numerous locations, or like, an abundance of staff. You naturally then want to have like protocols in place and procedures. And essentially what you and I are speaking to is that we, firsthand in the clinical environment, saw different ethical considerations come up as those procedures were implemented broadly, right? With many different
Mm-hmm.
populations, many different ages, many different circumstances, yada, yada, yada. And when finding those ethical considerations and then bringing them back, we were often met with, well, this is the procedure, rather than a
Mm-hmm.
dialogue around, how might this be a specific circumstance that we need to be flexible with, or have some type of special consideration with. And I think some of that's reflective just on like what we talked about earlier, systematic. But I think it's also reflective that a lot of people who are in community mental health in leadership positions or management positions have only worked there. That was our
Yeah.
case, you and I.
Yeah.
And when I think about who else was managers around me during the many different years of being in that position, or even being like direct staff and who was supervising me, they all had only worked in community mental health settings, to my understanding. Like,
Mm-hmm.
there could be exclusions to that, but it wouldn't have been a lot of experience elsewhere because it was never really spoken to or brought into it. And so, when I was in a supervising position there, right, and I'm reassigning cases based off caseload size, right, I had that feeling in my stomach. This isn't right. This is sticky,
Mm-hmm.
right? I feel like I'm setting
Mm-hmm.
here, left holding the bag, like you said. And in those moments, it felt off, or perhaps even wrong in that sense, but I wasn't necessarily admitting that to myself or allowing myself to really process that because of the systematic emphasis that this is just what we do. We can't say no to intakes. People have to be assigned. This is what we have to do. Right? There's a lack of choice
Right.
or autonomy within
Mm-hmm.
that. And I would imagine that gets reinforced, year after year, because management only knows that. Right? If you and I were to go and be supervisors in that setting again, boy, would we do things different, right? We would raise hell. But no, we're not taking new clients. That's unethical. Perhaps even illegal. Like, no, we're
Yeah.
just not doing that. We got to figure it out otherwise. There'd be a lot more like sturdiness to it that I think
Yes. Yes.
I think there's a lacking of that systematically, probably because of like everyone growing up in it. You don't know what you don't know.
I agree. I never really even thought about that or took that into consideration. Because again, like, I don't know exactly a better way to phrase it, but sometimes it's just like just doing the orders that are given from the top down. And like, what are you going to do? How are you going to challenge it? Like, you don't want to ruffle feathers because, one hand helps the other. So it's just so, and it can be so political in some aspect. You don't want it to be that way because, again, it shouldn't be that. It should be of the needs of the clients. But that was the part that probably aggravated me so many times, is because often felt like it wasn't that. Like that wasn't the goal. That wasn't the mission statement, was the needs of the client. It's just, how many people can we fit in this room is essentially how I felt so many times. It just was not a good feeling.
Mhm. Um, you speaking to that, so this idea of like autonomy, you and I've been using that word today. Uh, from like a developmental perspective, I can't not think this way. Um, like in toddlerhood, it goes from autonomy being a milestone developmental goal and it transitions into initiative. And
Hmm.
those two things being very closely intertwined and linked together. And you're speaking to, if you don't feel that you have a choice or you don't have autonomy, you don't have power, you don't have a voice or course of action available to you, that's going to directly impact your sense of initiative, your sense of curiosity, creativity. Maybe this could be done differently, right? Instead, it's, well, this is how we've always done it, or this is how we have to do it. So we're going to make it work like this, right? There's no initiative in that. Or
Hmm.
you can probably relate to this from your experience as a supervisor. Only certain people are allowed to be innovative or to have that sense of initiative, or there's only certain opportunities for it.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's it's I think it's kind of like just stifles some, right? Because then where's that ability to kind of just grow? Because again, we just get those orders of, okay, I need you here, I need you to do that. Where's that ability to kind of see where people's strengths are? That's why, again, I'm very happy that I was given the opportunity to work under you, because despite all of that, you somehow were able to manage a way to see us as your staff. And I saw how, in some way, you protected us from what some of the in office staff had to endure, and letting us trying to feel our own sense of independence as much as we could. And that's something that I greatly appreciated. And that's something I try to utilize even after taking your position with the staff that I was overseeing. But unfortunately, again, due to the circumstances of the pandemic, it didn't really allow for that. And I think that's what was very disheartening for me. And that's why I wasn't able to commit myself to that position as long as I had intended.
Well, and in many ways, I'm sure you're grateful for all of that, right? Like looking
Yeah.
back on it, because that then led you to where you are now. And with the autonomy that you've been experiencing in recent years, it's crazy to say that now, right? We're talking about years at this point.
Right.
We have been in this newfound setting for ourselves and newfound freedom. With that autonomy, I'm sure you can be reflective in identifying so many areas of initiative, so many areas of like, yep, I saw that as a need for myself or that as a need for my client, and I just acted. I just did what I needed to do and what I
Hmm.
felt was important to do in that moment. And the amount of like sense of flexibility that comes with that.
Yeah, most definitely. And, it's a constant surprise, working in the environment that I am. And it's a different type of support that I get. It's one that is truly welcome. And there's just so much sincerity from the owner that I work with. And it's just the encouragement that I receive. It's just so much. I often feel like, okay, like, I don't want to say I've maximized my growth, but I often feel like, okay, I'm at a good point that there has to be a limit to this. But like with the encouragement and support I get, like I'm reminded there is no limit to it. Like, let's see how much further we can help you grow. And it's very authentic in that regard because oftentimes I felt in community mental health, yes, there was encouragement for growth, but oftentimes the encouragement was for growth was because they saw you as an investment to help them. Where in private practice, I feel like the investment is to help me and my clients. It's just so much different.
Yeah, no, it's very relatable what you were just sharing, how it's again flipped where you are the most important. And when you are the most important, then your clients are going to benefit, right? That it's not from this like
Mm-hmm.
selfish, uh, somehow like detrimental perspective, right? Like narcissistic, you're the most important person, and fuck everybody else. But rather, is that like cliche analogy of like put your mask on yourself on the airplane when it's going down, rather than the people around you. Like you can't help others if you don't have oxygen,
Yeah.
right? And like I can't tell you how many like parents
Right.
I talked about that with, and staff, and yada 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 in community mental health, when like talking about it from this perspective now, it means so much of a different, it has so much of a different meaning now, right? That I can't show up ethically
Mm-hmm.
with my clients. I can't show up period for myself, clients, family, whomever, if my needs aren't met. Or I can show up, but in a
Right.
way that is to my detriment, and my health is going to somehow show it sooner rather than later, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. And it's just a different. I don't even want to say weight because it's not even a weight. It's just a whole different experience. I guess the opposite, I guess, like you said, the flip of that is it's not a weight, it's a lightness that I experience. Coming from a dreaded weight to a lightness. I don't carry the weight of the world on me.
I'll tell you this, I had no idea how like hypo aroused, kind of like dissociative stance I had physically in my body on a routine basis. Like, don't get me wrong, I can be anxious. I can be, but I more so will like have a baseline of just like disconnect as a way of coping. And it was so subtle. It was
Mm-hmm.
something I just didn't have understanding around, right? I'm disconnected, so I'm also not connected to it, right? Like it's just, oh, it was a way of being that definitely comes from my past, right? It's not reflective of community mental health, but it's how I naturally coped with that high baseline of stress. And what it would feel like and look like is I was just always so tired. And like have
Mm-hmm.
headaches, just like feel really like foggy, just super out of it by the end of the day. Kind of like what you said. I just got to like sit on the couch, go to bed, rinse, repeat, so on from there. And then, as you know, I had my son in the year leading up to me leaving community mental health. And then that's also the year that the pandemic started. And to be disconnected in that way is not sustainable for the mom that I want to be, right? It was very much on my radar that this is something that was getting in the way. And at the time, I conceptualized it as like, I'm just so stressed at work, right? I can't like maintain this stress level with him. But as I switched into private practice and I carried over the like scheduling practices of community mental health, where like I can see 7 or 8 people in a day, or you know what I mean? Like I can like do notes through my lunch or whatever
Yep.
it might be, right? Just like the little like nuanced things, like habits I picked up from community mental health. That it wasn't even like I felt like the group practice I transitioned to was telling me I had to do it. It was more like, oh, this is how I do it. This is what I know. This is what I can do.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was such a transitionary period that first year in group practice of recognizing um, I don't see that many clients in a day. And in fact, that feeling I have at the end of being tired or disconnected is reflective of me doing too much in the day, and reflective of some own healing that I needed to do, I've done, I'm doing, right? Like I've experienced some radical changes in myself over the past several years. But the feeling I had at the end of my workday was uh kind of like one of the biggest red flags I saw, because it followed me into group practice, right? It's like, oh, this
Mm-hmm.
is something I'm doing, not just my response to a setting, right? Because the setting's changed. And so fast forward to present day,
Right.
I mean, my entire business model is different from back then. I do intensive, I do longer sessions, but I'm working like 5 6 hour days with an hour break in there somewhere, you know, and that's good for me.
Mm-hmm.
That's good for my body. I'm
Yeah.
showing up for my clients as a therapist I want to be, even if they're my last client of the day, right? They're getting a good version of me. But like those are some of like the little things that I've like come to notice of just how much, learning how to be a therapist in a particular setting is obviously going to have its impact, right? And there's a lot of unlearning
Yeah.
to do, but also we chose that setting and stayed in it for a reason. And the learning and meaning making for us as individuals around that, and how we can make sure we're not repeating history again, you know? Kind of like what you were speaking to
Yeah.
earlier, about like it
I
feeling.
mean, yeah, I'm sorry. I was going to say, I love the fact that I recently told my partner, like, my ideal day is seeing 3 to 5 people a day. And that's such a wonderful feeling because I remember like having back to back clients. And even when I was a supervisor, still seeing clients, having clients meetings, like that was just taxing. And being able to kind of arrange my schedule that fits a lifestyle I want is it's just a beautiful feeling.
Mhm. Well, as you have been reflecting on this here with me, do you have any other areas of thriving that you're noticing that you'd want to share?
I it's more a personal journey in that regard, meaning more so be more self-reflective. Um, I have not ever shied away from recognizing my own struggles with my own mental health. But I feel like for so many years, it was more so let us just go ahead and put a band aid on this until we have time to actually resolve it.
Mm,
And now I feel like I have the ability to be able to kind of really sit with it and kind of process it. And it again allows me to show up differently in my various relationships. I think more so my relationship with my family. And that's something that's very important to me. And even my friendships, many people inform me that they've not really ever seen me look more happier, which is again such a feeling that I just thought I wasn't even aware that I was missing, but I'm very grateful to be experiencing.
mm-hmm. That's beautiful and very relatable, right? It's like you don't know what you don't know, and you don't experience what
Hmm.
you don't experience in the sense, right? And so this like newfound everything for us then has this like ripple effect that there is no way for us to anticipate or know on the other side of it, right? The beginning
Yeah.
side of it. And then fast forward, you and I
Hmm.
are sitting here doing a podcast episode, right? Like, and we have time on a Friday morning, you know? It's beautiful.
Right. I
To cry a
didn't
bit
have
at,
to rearrange like 4 clients.
yeah, or just have
Yeah,
like
most
stress,
definitely.
like I got to get back to something, you know?
Or like my phone's been blowing up with 20 emails. Yeah.
Yep, all marked as urgent.
It's a good gosh, yes.
Mhm. Well, Elena, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a pleasure. It's always an honor. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, we'll catch you later, everybody. I hope you all have a good day.
Bye.